I'm Bob. I like coffee. I also like to tell stories. So, here at the Bobcast Coffee, it's time for a coffee break. So, take a coffee break with me and pour yourself a cup of your favorite Joe. By the time you're done with your coffee, you'll know something about me you really didn't need to know. But you'll have fun learning it. Just remember, my stories are true. For the most part.
This episode was brought to you by JM Insurance. JM Insurance. Do you have business, personal, or life insurance yet? Contact JM Insurance Agency to understand the benefits of insuring against the unforeseen circumstances of life. We have over 40 years of experience in the business and will guide with the best probable choice for your situation. Call us for more information at 405-353-0140 or visit our website at jminsurance.agency.
Hey, it's time for another Bobcast Coffee. Grab your cup. Time to take a break. I believe this is going to be episode, 67. And we're going to try something different today. First. For this break, we're going to start a conversation with one of my Bobs, Bob Reynolds, my uncle. And something that he's done that no one else in the family's done. And we're going to talk about flying. Not just flying anything, but we're also going to be talking about his whole career as a pilot. And my fascination is his time with Phantom Jets. So, hang tight. Keep your parachute on. Here we go. Episode 67. And I said, today, I'm here talking with one of my favorite people, my Uncle Bob. So, Bob Reynolds. Meet Bob Reynolds.
Good day. Good morning. Whatever.
Whenever someone clicks into this.
Yep.
So the whole reason I wanted to talk to you was about one of the things that you've done that nobody else in our family has ever done. And
correct.
You flew for a long time for the military.
24 years.
20.
But then I flew for almost 10 as a civilian. So let's just say that I've private stuff. So I have at least 35 years doing this, which is a good chunk of my life.
So this is something I've never done. And at 61, probably not going to start that as a career.
Probably not.
So I would very much like to know how you got into flying.
Well, then it's kind of a long story. Would you like the long story or the short version?
Hey, you give me the long story and I'll edit it.
Okay. The long version is that ever since I was a little boy, I don't know, 10 years old or so, I had something in common with my dad that your dad didn't have. My dad loved to look at airplanes. He loved to look at them flying. He had a kind of just an innate interest in airplanes. And his office was just a few houses from where I lived. This was in Illinois. And back then, airplanes flew much lower than they do now. So I think it was more like pilot's choice. If you wanted to have your passengers sightsee, they would go down quite low. And maybe the pilot was point out at sights as he goes along, but you could hear those planes coming from a long way off because they were all piston engine airplanes. And my dad, I would run outside when I heard this airplane, and he would run outside of his office. And we would both be standing on a sidewalk that we could see each other. And he was just as excited about it as me. Well, that that was some kind of bond that we had. And then later, we had a friend who had an airplane called an Air Coupe, which is a two-seat airplane, a metal airplane that's, you probably would never see one now because they're very, very old. But he took me and my dad up for a flight when I was probably 10 years old. Of course, it was a two-seater, so I had to sit on my dad's lap. And later on, I found out that this guy didn't even have a pilot's license. He just was one of them kind of guys that would.
He just happened to have a plane.
He just happened to. He had money, and he bought a plane, and he wanted it for a toy, but he didn't want to go through all the process of getting a license, and so he didn't. But that was my very first experience, and when I got up in the air, like I say, I was a little boy and sitting on his lap. I was fascinated by how you could look down and see. Remember, the proverbial people look like ants? Well, that was the way it was. I said, man, look at those tiny little people in cars and stuff like that. Fascinated. So as I grew up, I never lost that interest. In fact, one of the things that when I was in high school playing sports, every time a plane would fly over, I would look up. And I was always fascinated by the other players. They didn't look up. And I thought, well, gosh, that's so interesting to see that plane going by. And they seemed to not care. So there was something different about me as opposed to anybody else. So I went through college, and I knew that if the one thing that I thought I could do would be a pilot, but I thought it was a long shot, because I didn't have a great education. I wasn't necessarily the smartest knife in the drawer, the sharpest knife in the drawer, but I did graduate from college, as you know. And at that time, there was something that was going on in the world that was bad, but it was great for me. And that was the Vietnam War. If it hadn't been for the Vietnam War, the government or the Air Force would not be that interested in pilots. So I was about to graduate, and I knew that I had to get into the military quick because they were drafting people in the Army. And I certainly didn't want to be in the Army. So I went down to the recruiters, and they had two offices. One was the Navy office, and one was the Air Force. There was probably an Army guy there, but I wasn't interested. So I went in and I took the aptitude test for both of them, Navy and Air Force. And my thinking was, I'm in a hurry to get into the military. I'll take whichever one calls me up first. But it just so happened the Air Force called first. And I went and took my physical, and I passed my physical and went down to well, no, I didn't go anywhere. They just informed me that I had one eye that wasn't quite 20/20. And therefore, they only were taking pilots into training that had 20/20 vision. And I didn't have it. But they said, you got good enough to be a navigator. So I said, I don't even know what a navigator is, but I'll sign on for that one. And they said, you do fly, you're a rated navigator. And I took that job. I went to navigator school. Many people said, Bob, you know you're not smart enough to be a navigator because you got to know all kinds of math and stuff like that, geometry, and you'll never cut it. Well, I did cut it, and I was a navigator for almost 4 years. Well, the Air Force during that 4 years was losing a lot of pilots in Vietnam. If you know anything about the air war, there was a lot of planes shot down.
It happens that one of my friends in California was an F-4 pilot that got shot down, and he spent the war at the Hanoi Hotel.
Well, that was that and other things. They needed more pilots. So the Air Force came out with a ruling that said, well, if you got eyes good enough to be a navigator, you got eyes good enough to be a pilot. Boy, it took me a microsecond to go to the I don't know, personnel guy at the base and say, I want to get into this pilot school. And took me a while to get it because of so many other people that were getting in. But I did get in pilot training. And a funny story was I had never really flown an airplane. So when I got there, I found out that almost everybody in my class was like a private pilot. They had had some time in an airplane, so they had a leg up on me. And by the fact that I was a senior guy who had been a navigator for 4 years, I outranked everybody in the class. So I was the class commander. Well, when we got into it, flying, the very first airplane you fly is called a T-41. It's a Cessna 172, just a military version. Well, I went to Enid, Oklahoma for training. And anybody that knows anything about Oklahoma knows that the wind blows all the time hard.
Well, and Enid is just a wonderful place to be.
Right. Yeah. Although I didn't mind it because I was in pilot training. Well, the T-41 training was only 3 weeks. So they expected you from going from nothing to a private pilot, basically, in 3 weeks. Everybody in that class could fly that T-41 better than me. My instructor would say, Reynolds, why can't you figure out how to get a crosswind landing? Because I'd be all over the place. Sometimes I'd run off the side of the runway, and the big shots at the base, the colonels, called me in and said, we want to talk to you. Said, we hear you're having trouble out there in that T-41. I said, trouble? I said, I'm just hanging on. And they said, well, here's the deal. It's going to look really bad if within 3 weeks we wash out the class commander because you ain't passing. But we're going to make an exception in your case. We're going to pass you. We're just going to go right past the T-41. Because like I say, they did not want the other students to see me go bye-bye. We'll go back to being a navigator. So anyway, I started flying the T-37, and that's a little twin-engine jet, not a supersonic plane, but a trainer. And the very first day that I went out to fly, it was called the dollar ride, where the instructor would take you up and he would basically do a few things. But he asked me, he said, you want to try a landing? Well, we sat side by side. It was that kind of plane. And of course, it had a stick and a throttle. Well, that looked, everything about that plane looked familiar. It had a jet engine. It had all the things that a jet engine had. And it just was heavier than a T-41. I greased that sucker on. The instructor said, dadgum, that's pretty good. First landing. I said, yeah, thank God. And from that day on, I was at the top of the class, graduated as a distinguished graduate, I only look back at that T-41 incident, said, it's so nice that they said, we're not going to wash you out because you can't fly this stupid plane. And I don't know if you've ever tried to fly a T-41, but I guarantee you that if I did right now, I'd probably be just as bad as I was 50 years ago. So anyway, that's how I got to be a pilot, was I graduated and I was at the top of my class, so I got one of the first choices. And I had some buddies that were flying RF-4s. And one of them got killed over in Vietnam. And I thought, well, RF-4 that sounds like something that would be fun to fly. And so they sent me off to South Carolina, and I started flying the RF-4 there.
What year would that be?
That would be 1972. It's 1972.
We're talking to the very end of...
Vietnam was right coming to an end.
Yeah.
And that's why when I graduated from F4 school in South Carolina, instead of going to Vietnam, they sent me to Germany. So I spent 4 years flying RF-4s in Germany, and it was the best experience of my life because it was just fun. It was back when the Air Force pretty much dominated the German government, and they could have free reign on what they did. And we could just go out and waste gas. And I've got pictures of almost every castle that was ever built in Germany. And we used to go over and fly in England. And I've got pictures of almost every castle that was in England. Same thing with Belgium. We used to have an exchange program with Belgium and the Netherlands. And their pilots would come to Germany and fly their planes. And we would go to their base and fly our planes. And it was a lot of fun. So the military, I never had to go to combat because there was, but after 11 years of flying in the Air Force, things were getting kind of nasty. And the reason they were getting nasty was they had all these pilots who they drafted in during Vietnam, and now they had too many pilots. So what they were doing is they were making all the pilots become things that weren't, they called it rated supplements. In other words, you were still a pilot, but you didn't fly. And they made me a club officer of the officers club in Idaho. Well, when I got to Idaho, I didn't really like that. Well, I started finding out that you could get into the National Guard. And the National Guard was taking on a lot of these F-4s that had been surplus, so to speak. This was back when the National Guard didn't do a whole lot but have fun too. And so I found this unit in Alabama, and I called up the wing commander and I said, I'm getting out of the Air Force here in about a month. I'd like to come out and see if I could get into your unit. And he said, well, you just might. Come on out and let's talk. Well, I guess I drove. I don't know how I got there, but I drove from Idaho to Alabama. And the guy said, yeah, we can use you. And bingo, I was. That's how I finished out 11 years in the regular Air Force and whatever makes up 24 in the National Guard. And that was more fun than flying in Germany.
Well, when were you flying the Navy stuff?
Okay, when there was an outfit in Birmingham, which was just across the runway from the National Guard base, and that they had a overhaul facility, and their main airplane was KC-135s and C-130s, and the Air Force would bring in a tanker, and they would strip it down to nothing, and overhaul, rehab it, and put it back on the line. And the Air Force was real happy with what they were doing. And so when you're in the Guard, you got to have a supplemental job. You can't just live off the Guard. So I went over there, and they made me a quality control person. I knew nothing about quality control, but they did. They said, well, this is what you're going to be. So I was working there, getting a decent salary, and things were going along pretty good. And then one day they came in and said, we got a big contract with the Navy. The Navy wants us to overhaul all of these airplanes that had been on carriers in Vietnam, and they were really rough. And they were exposed to salt, the salt water. And so anyway, they said they need some pilots, and the Navy doesn't want to ship in pilots to fly what they call functional test flights. And a functional test flight is where you take one out of when it's finished, before it's painted, it's still got primer paint on it, and you fly and do everything that airplane's supposed to do.
So basically, you're strapped to two big rockets, going through the air, twisting and turning to see if any bolts fall out?
Absolutely, and bolts fell out all the time. It was only the Lord was keeping me alive, because there were so many opportunities to engines would catch on fire. One flap would come up and the other one wouldn't, and the airplane wanted to like roll over. But the reason there were so many incidents was because Hayes, that was the name of the company, they thought that an F4 was just basically a little C-130. And it would be just as easy to work on an F4. Well, they didn't realize that an F4 had so many more systems than a C-130. And it ate their lunch. They had all kinds of difficulties. But anyway, the job lasted, 3 or 4 years. And I had a friend that was flying for Bell South, their corporate planes. He was in the Guard also. And he said, I think I can get you a job with Bell South. And I said, man, if you could, I'd sure like to get out of this F4 business. And so anyway, I got a job with the flight department of Bell South, and they had a bunch of planes. But I want to show you a picture. This is,
Oh, yeah.
can you see that? That's me in the Navy, I'm not in the Navy. They furnished me a civilian flight helmet and a flight suit that I could customize. And anyway, that's me in front of a Navy F4 that had been painted. But anyway, that's that. That was the end of that story. And I went to work for Bell South, and I started flying. The first airplane I flew for Bell South was this one. Can you see that one? Am I holding it okay?
Yeah.
That's what they call a Stretch King Air.
Was
It's
that a turbojet or a
turboprop?
turbo
Twin engine, held 20 passengers and 2 pilots. And we flew that airplane back and forth between Atlanta and Birmingham. I don't know how many thousands of times. That was our route. And we hauled people who were over departments in both cities, and they would go and visit their counterparts. So that airplane I flew for about 5 years, I guess.
So that was the Skype before there was Skype. You had to physically go somewhere for a meeting.
They had to go. Yes. I didn't catch what you said, but that's true. And then I got to fly in the other airplanes that they had, Bell South had, and that's those. Can you see those?
Yeah, yeah.
Those are all jets, no turboprops there. And I got a type rating in every one. And, well, there is one turboprop back there. So Dornier, a German airplane. Actually, I don't know I think it's a German airplane. Dornier you might have heard that in World War II. They made fighter planes, Dornier did. But anyway, and then we had a French airplane, a Falcon, was made in France. And then we had a couple of Cessnas, which were made in Wichita. And of course, I love those airplanes. And that we got out of flying just back and forth to to Atlanta. And what happened then was I got to fly executives all over the United States and sometimes into Canada. And I'd get to hobnob with the big shots to see how they lived, but it was kind of fun. Lots of good stories came out of that. But anyway, I retired. They were moving to San Antonio. Bell South had become AT&T. And AT&T's headquarters was in San Antonio at the time. And so all of our pilots were going to get transferred down there, except 2 of us. And we were what they call retirement eligible. The others weren't. Well, I took my early retirement, started drawing a retirement pay, and life was good. And I had a friend who flew one of those airplanes that Bell South had that I was current in. And he went down, he had a job with this lady who was filthy rich and had her own jet had her own yacht and owned 5 houses in different parts of the country. And she would have us fly, or she would have him fly to either the yacht or to the, which was based in Miami. She lived in Atlanta. And anyway, one time they went down to Costa Rica, and she said, I'm going to be down here for 10 days. So he said to himself, I think I'll drive back to Georgia. I have a friend who has a boat on the beach, and he said I could use it anytime I wanted. So he and his wife he flew back to Atlanta, got a car, drove to this thing, and while he was out on the beach, he gets a phone call. And the phone call says, this was back when they had cell phones by now. She said, I'm going to go home early. We're going to leave in the morning. And he said, well, I'm in Georgia. And I got this boat. I got a rental car. There's no way I can make it down there by in the morning. And he said, I think I got a fix. He said, I know a guy who's current in the plane you fly. I'll call him up and see if he can go down and sit in my place as a co-pilot. And he called me up and said, I said, yeah, I guess I can do it. And it was going to pay a pretty good chunk of change to do this.
Always the helpful part, right?
Yeah, that was the good part. So he sent me, well, he didn't send me, but somehow I ended up getting a ticket on Delta. Am I talking too much on this thing?
No.
Okay. Okay. All right. So he sent me a ticket I went to the airport, and I guess the ticket was at the will call place. All I had was a shaving kit because I didn't know how long I was going to be down there, but I assumed I wasn't going to be down there, but just a little bit. So I got on the Delta and flew to Costa Rica and landed at whatever the main airport is there, it's the capital. And, when they shut the engines down, everybody stands up and starts grabbing their bags. Well, somebody comes on and says, would everybody take their seat? It was like a policeman. And everybody take their seat. And then he says, is there a Bob Reynolds on board?
No.
And I said, as a matter of fact, here I held up my hand, and he said, would you come with me? Now, I didn't know if I was in trouble because I didn't have a passport or anything. So he says, follow me. Well, then they started letting the passengers off, and they were all going through customs, except me, who went like a bullet. I went right through customs, down a flight of stairs, and there I was out on the ramp of the airport. And the passengers, the rich lady and her friends, were sitting in the airplane. And I got in the airplane. The guy that was the captain, the pilot, he started the engines, and we were out of there. And so I spent maybe a total of 15 minutes in Costa Rica. But when I got home, back to Atlanta, Jim, my friend, he managed to get back to Atlanta also for whatever. And she ceremoniously fired him on the spot. Then she turned to me and said, you want a job? And I said, yeah, I'll work for you. And she paid a good salary. But it was a short-lived job because she wanted a bigger airplane, but they couldn't build this bigger airplane until maybe a year. But it was going to be a Gulfstream. I don't know if you know what a Gulfstream is, very expensive jet. So she was going to buy a Gulfstream, but she wanted it right then. And they said, well, it'll be next year before we can get you one. And that she said, they said to her, we'll fly you anywhere you want to go. You just call us up and say, I want to go to Costa Rica, or I want to go to Miami, or anywhere. And we'll send a Gulfstream plane and 2 pilots, and we'll fly you. Well, now I was surplus.
You're out of a job.
So I was out of a job. Well, just so happened I bought a motorhome from a dealer, a motorhome. Come to find out, this guy was a pilot, the owner of the company. And he took a liking to me because I bought the very first motorhome that his company ever sold. In other words, they had just got into the RV business, and so I was like special. Well, he offered me a job flying King Airs, which I had a lot of time in. And he was in the movie business. He provided all the equipment, or not all the equipment, but most of the equipment when they went out on location. Generators, the star trailers, all that kind of stuff. That's what he did. So we would go around to where they were shooting movies, and he would politic for the next gig. And so I got to see a lot of movies being made and seeing actors that you would know their names. That was a real fun job. So anyway, that worked out for a while until his son got old enough to get his pilot's license. That put me out of a job. And that was it. I retired again. And like I say, I know I've got over 30 years of doing this, but every job I ever had was great. Even the one flying the T-41. And I was so lucky, I can honestly say that I never had to work a day in my life because I enjoy, and I think that's the secret to being a pilot, is you got to really enjoy it. You can't look at it as a job because you're gone a lot. If you're married, you're away from home multiple nights. And so your wife has got to be very supportive. In my case, she was. So she knew that it was important to me because it was important to me, and she knew that that's what I like to do, and that's the story of my piloting.
So at this point, we're gonna just take a break, and we'll come back and finish this story with Uncle Bob on a later podcast. But as of now, I think it's time. We've spent enough time here. It's time to get back to work, finish your coffee, go have a great day. And remember, everybody has a great story.